Hi, hello, and welcome to the Hindus webinar on Venezuela. I'm Stanley Johny, your foreign affairs editor, and I'm also joined by my friend and colleague Srinivasan Ramani today to discuss, what's happening in Venezuela, in Latin America, and in the wider world. We have seen unprecedented, dramatic developments, in the recent days. You see, Venezuela was invaded by the United States on January 3rd, and its sitting president Nicolas Maduro was kidnapped, who is now in jail in the United States, facing charges of narco terrorism. And then, Venezuela has now a new interim government led by Delcy Rodriguez, who was the former vice president. And Donald Trump has made outlandish claims ever since. He said that Venezuela is going to turn over 30 to 50 million barrels of oil to the United States. And Mr. Trump's energy secretary, Chris Wright, yesterday, while speaking at a conference in Miami, said that the United States plans to control Venezuela's oil sales indefinitely. And the Energy Department put this in a document. They issued a fact sheet yesterday, and then they made the same claims on Wednesday, on 8th of January. And then the U.S. Energy Department says that the American government will continue to control Venezuela's oil resources indefinitely. And then they will control the money. They will keep this in international banks, and they will control the money, and they will use that money to basically, for the benefit of both the Americans and the Venezuelans, quote unquote. And Donald Trump had tweeted yesterday saying that Venezuela will also get a share of that money, but the Venezuelans will use that money to buy only American products. I mean, it's fascinating. The United States is all said and done. It's a different country, and they want to take over and control the oil resources and oil sales of a different country. The sitting president has been kidnapped. And there is a new government, and the Venezuelan government is also, I think, trying to figure out what's happening or how to deal with the United States. So the question, the idea of sovereignty is being breached. International law, nobody is talking about international law and rules, etc., anymore. And also, what kind of a message this action sends to other powers, both big powers, great powers, as well as smaller powers. Especially countries with natural resources, including countries in the Persian Gulf region. So what kind of a message the United States is sending? What kind of a message the United States is sending to other countries in the Western Hemisphere, relatively weaker countries? You still have both right-wing and left-wing governments in the Western Hemisphere, especially in the Caribbean region. So to discuss all these questions, you're welcome to the webinar. First, let me ask my colleague Srini. Srini, could you take us through the developments in Venezuela? How do you look at Trump's attack on Venezuela and the subsequent developments, and also the response of the Venezuelan government?
Muted. Yeah. Thank you, Stan. As you rightly pointed out, this actions, while seen in the history of US interventions in Latin America and other parts of the world, also has its own distinction, in the sense that the way a sitting president has been kidnapped and abducted and taken to New York for trial on trumped-up charges, on charges of drug trafficking, for which there is no proof. If you look at the reasons proffered by the US before they went on this series of antagonistic actions against Venezuela, this included, attacks on boats carrying civilians, saying that these were basically transporting drugs without any proof, and these attacks were also authorized without any congressional authorization. This included the imposition of a naval blockade, trying to interdict ships that were transporting oil from Venezuela legitimately for trade, and then now the recent action of going ahead and abducting the elected president. What surprises? All these don't surprise me, in the sense that these are all an extreme version of the kind of interventions that the United States has done in other parts of the world. But what makes this distinct is the almost impunity and the a devil-may-care attitude of the United States president to international law. In fact, in today's interview in New York Times, that he had given to the New York Times, he said that when he was asked whether his administration need to abide by international law, he said, "I don't need international law." And if there was any limits on his global powers, he said, uh, there is just one limit, and that is his own morality, his own mind. It is the only thing that can stop me. So essentially, what he has done is he will use any instrument of military, economic, or political power that the America has as one of the superpowers in the world today to do whatever he wants in terms of how the United States wants to conduct its foreign policy, and that could mean invading Venezuela on the flimsiest of reasons. In fact, no reasons being proffered which are genuine. Now threatening Colombia, now threatening even an ally like Denmark, which is NATO part of Denmark part of NATO, Stan? Yeah, they are part of NATO, right?
Yeah. They are.
Threatening a NATO ally that they are going to capture Greenland and not ruling out that they would use military force to do so. So there is this level of imperialism and impunity that was not evinced by previous US presidents. So that is the first thing that we have to talk about, and we should be careful about. Specifically regarding Venezuela, one interesting thing is that after Maduro was removed, the PSUV, the ruling party of Venezuela, has actually closed ranks, and now it still controls power. And the US government seems to also tolerate this. This is interesting because the expectation was that this popular politician, Maria Machado, who's the current Nobel Prize winner for peace, who is an opposition leader in Venezuela, she would have been backed by the United States. After all, she has been saying everything that can please the US president. She has welcomed the invasion even before the invasion happened. She has talked about privatizing all downstream, upstream, and every economic lever of oil extraction that is the lifeline of Venezuela, and giving it all to the United States. She has even amplified some of the more absolutely nonsensical nonsensical claims made by the Trump regime, including the fact that when Trump lost the election lost the previous election in 2020, the 2021 rather, one of the allegations that was made was that the Venezuelan government intervened in elections, and this woman Machado has amplified those claims, clearly trying as much as possible to be in the good books of Mr. Trump, and yet Mr. Trump dismissed her, saying she doesn't have any popularity. And they have gone on to not upset the regime. They have only removed Maduro, but they have not removed the regime in power. That suggests that that is just two things from the American point of view, and I guess Trump made this decision because the CIA advised him to do so. The Americans realized that the Bolivarian movement is not something a pushover, and they control the state not just because of the Maduro's popularity or the former president Hugo Chavez's popularity, but they have effective control of the state over several institutions with popular support. And they think that if they went ahead with regime change right away, it will result in massive instability, and it would upset their plans. And clearly, they have learned lessons from their interventions in Iraq. So that is from the American point of view. From the Venezuelan point of view, it is clear that the PSUV, the Bolivarian state in particular, was anticipating some kind of crisis of this kind, and the moves that they have made post the coup or post the abduction of Maduro suggests that they have planned in advance how this transition will happen, and the selection of Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, who was the vice president under Maduro, and who also has been credited with some kind of economic resurgence that has happened in the last 3-4 years after a massive economic failure under the Maduro regime. I won't say Venezuela was out of the docks, but it still it used to suffer hyperinflation of more than 100,000%, but that fell down to 600%. which is a steep fall, but still bad. The oil production went up from 300 barrels a day to 1.5 million barrels a day. So Delcy Rodriguez, as a minister of, as a person who was in charge of the economy, managed to, turn things around a bit, largely thanks to Chinese and Russian help. And clearly, she was seen as the most credible person who could tie different interests within the Bolivarian state, which is an authoritarian state. Let us also admit that, to take things forward. And interestingly, on the first day of when she was sworn in as the interim president after Maduro was abducted, where she struck a note of defiance, saying Maduro is still our president, calling U.S. actions for what it is. The next day, she came up with a conciliatory note talking about how Venezuela can cooperate with the United States. So clearly, this is a president who understands that this is an extraordinary situation and pragmatism is also important. After all, if the U.S. can be bought off with oil supplies and the regime can continue, that is a mode of operation that Ms. Rodriguez might pursue. And very interestingly, Delcy Rodriguez is now the president. Her brother, he's the head of the assembly,
National Assembly head, no,
National
George
Assembly.
Rodriguez. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the third phase of the government is Diosdado Caballo, who is in charge of the party. So these three have closeted ranks and have taken some kind of a distribution of responsibility among each other to continue the regime.
Is there a power struggle between Caballo and the Rodriguez siblings, Srini?
We don't know for sure, because the Western media will always try to project these things from a hostile point of view. We could also read it as cohabitation of different interests. Caballo seemed to be some kind of a hardliner who does not believe in the pragmatism of Ms. Rodriguez. But at the same time, this pragmatism is necessary. Even the Cuban government, for example, has liberalized in the last few years. So this autarkic or entirely state-led development model in a very globalized world, in which powers are fighting very hard to control resources of control areas of resources, and also global trade and so on. In that situation, taking a ideological autarkic approach by nationalizing or nationalizing the economy and controlling the economy through the state, it's not pragmatic. And Delcy Rodriguez in the last couple of years has tried to win over support from some of the traditional Venezuelan elite, and she has given concessions to the what is called the Venezuelan bourgeoisie. And at the same time, she has also tried to ensure that the oil production is improved by having ties with European firms, with having ties with Russia and China in particular. So these pragmatic steps might be resisted by hardline elements who believe that these are concessions to the Venezuelan right. But at the same time, the fact that these have worked in the last couple of years suggests that Mr. Caballo might actually tolerate these measures because these are pragmatic. So it depends on how Ms. Rodriguez takes the takes this momentum forward. If this results in more expropriation by the United States and and a naked power grab, by interests who are in cahoots with the United States government, then probably you might see a split between Caballo and Rodriguez. But if this is done in a balanced way, then you might see that these forces might cohabit, and for the purposes of regime survival, they might still collaborate and cooperate with each other. That's how I look at it.
Yeah,
Again, we'll have to wait and watch.
Since you talked about Machado had said even before the American attack that she absolutely supports Trump's Venezuela policy. And after the attack, she said that she was even willing to share the Nobel Prize with Donald Trump. And I was also looking at some of the criticisms of the Jan 3rd attack from the Western scholars and policymakers, from across both sides of the Atlantic. And their main criticism was that Trump did not do this to restore democracy. I mean, they don't find a problem with the attack, the violation of the sovereignty, the abduction of a sitting president, whether that president is good or bad, dictator or Democrat. At the end of the day, he was the president, right? So nobody finds faults with it. I mean, their problem is that, okay, Trump had attacked Venezuela, and why he is not making Machado or the other one who stood in the elections in the last time. Yeah. Why they are not being restored in power? I mean, it's interesting. Just one more thing about the Venezuelan government. So you said the Venezuelan government now, the interim authorities are sending a message of conciliation, right, or some pragmatic approach. But Trump doesn't want any kind of conciliation, any reconciliatory messages. You look at the statements he made. He wants complete surrender of Venezuela's oil resources. Even the New York Times interview that you referred to, Trump says that, I mean, in the long term, the United States plans to control Venezuela's oil resources. So, will the Bolivarian movement, which you said is still, I mean, it still has that ideological or street muscle, and the government is still in place. So will the Bolivarian and the military strongly supports the government, and
Right.
maybe the Americans are right. The military or the government is not an easy pushover.
Correct.
In the long run, they might still want to bring in the regime change, because in the case of Syria, it took 13 years.
Yeah.
So likewise, it in the long run they would like to push the regime, but in the short run they are not planning to do that. But will the government accept the diktats of Washington, like American companies going and taking over the resources and controlling the sales forever?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer. Primarily, I think the state's first priority would be to get Venezuela out of its economic problem, right? The actions by the United States is one thing, but the economy is in dire straits, and unless it has external support that counterweighs what the United States is doing, it cannot look for any radical measure, right? So the situation as it finds now is it's been under siege, right? It is a government under siege, and what it would like to do is if the regime has to be in power, then it has to have popular support. If it has to have popular support, then it has to be seen as being helping Venezuelan citizens. Now, what is the only thing that the Venezuelan government or Venezuela as a nation has that allows it to or can allow it to get out of this morass, right? It's humongous oil wealth, right? Now, interestingly, now let's delve a bit into Venezuela's oil resources. While Venezuela has the highest oil resource in the world, its oil is a very heavy crude oil, right? It needs diluents, it needs refining, technology that's slightly more difficult and expensive proposition to actually, sell that refined oil into the market, right? And that requires investment, that requires partnership with countries which have the technology to do so. Now, when Hugo Chavez, for example, came to power in 1999, he didn't come up with immediate radicalization or immediate control of the oil sector under the government, right? He wanted partnerships. He actually, wanted good relations with the Venezuelan elite and tried to negotiate deals with the United States and so on. But it was the United States which actually tried, at the same time, domestically, he tried to get a constituent assembly elected for more democratization, which was his promise, because Venezuela was being controlled by a two-party elite that had made a country extremely unequal. So at one level he was being conciliatory to foreign powers, and other level in the domestic arena he wanted a greater democratization. How did the US respond? They responded by promoting a coup, under this leader Carmona, and which included support by Machado, by the way, in 2002. And that's the reason why Chavez actually went on to took a left turn. Secondly, the PDVSA, the Venezuela's oil, the behemoth.
State oil company.
Yeah, exactly. So the PDVSA also came up with a kind of strike in 2002 to halt production, just as a pressure tactic against the elected government. So what did Chavez do? He dismissed 18,000 employees who were basically who he called were state within a state, who are not responsive to the state's economic intentions. And then since then, what has happened is that a lot of professional elements of the PDVSA were dismissed, and PDVSA became a company which did not have this expertise to develop its oil resources in a way that could benefit. And luckily, in the first 10 years of Chavez's tenure, the commodity prices in the world were high because China had a huge demand for oil, and that was when the oil boom happened, and he managed to get a lot of revenues from the oil sector. But at the same time, PDVSA professionalization of PDVSA was not complete. Rather, it became a political vehicle. So as soon as the oil prices fell, the crisis started coming in, and since then it has been a long downturn for Venezuela's oil. So I think the current regime recognizes that in order to firstly, they haven't diversified the economy. That is a bigger problem, but that's a long-term problem. In the short term, they realize that if they have to maximize revenues from the oil sector and to use it for sprucing up their economy, they need international cooperation, which they tried out with China, Russia, etc. But without the United States, participating in this, because the United States also came up with sanctions in 2000 during the Obama regime. Later, during the Trump administration, they came up with severe sanctions that cut oil production dramatically. So in the immediate, they realized that they'd have no other go but to humor the United States in protecting its professionalizing its oil sector. Now, if they manage it properly, like if they give Trump, they have said that they'll give 50 million barrels of oil to the United States. If Trump is satisfied with that, or rather the oil companies in the United States are satisfied with that, and some kind of a quid pro quo can be achieved in the sense that, America gets this windfall oil. At the same time, the regime controls power, and at the same time, by selling this oil to the United States, it's also able to get some investment and development of its oil sector. This, in the interim, will probably stave off the worst kind of crisis it is facing. So I think that is its expectation. But with Trump, you never know. Here is a bully who is not really, as you rightly pointed, who is not really doing this for the interests of the Venezuelan people or the interests of America per se, but to whet whatever isolationist and imperialist impulse of his. That's why I wanted to ask that question to you, Stan. Can you explain this international movement? Where no rules apply, no laws apply, and for you and us, for you and me, who want to understand things using history, using to understand this moment using history, using logic, this is still incomprehensible because this is a almost an unprecedented situation.
Yeah. What happened in Venezuela is naked imperialism. There is no doubt about it. We in a sense, the scholarly student community give different explanations. We call it the reinvention of Monroe Doctrine, or some call it Monroe Doctrine, whatever. So Monroe Doctrine itself was, in 1820s, the United States. It tried to basically reassert its control in the Western Hemisphere to keep Europeans at bay. So it didn't want the European powers to come and control, basically, or they wanted to keep the European imperialism away, European interference away, so that basically the Caribbean waters and South America will remain under America's dominance. But here, basically, Trump says this is a reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine. But what you witnessed in Venezuela is basically, they invaded the country. Nobody is using the word, apparently. Washington Post editorial called it a bold action. And it's a victory for Trump. And even Fareed Zakaria called it a bold military operation. All these people are, they spend a lot of energy attacking the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We call it the invasion of Ukraine. It is a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yeah, definitely, yeah. But when it comes to Venezuela, you find all kind of words. But it's interesting that, one is the violation of Venezuelan sovereignty, and Trump openly says that he is not committed to international law. He's now withdrawing the United States from international organizations, which happened 2 days later. So basically, what the United States, I think, is doing is that it is today acting like a rogue superpower. And that is also because, the United States was talking about the rules-based order as long as the rules-based order favored America's standing in the world. And during the Cold War, they talked about the free world, so-called free world against the Soviet-led order. So the world was divided. We know that. And after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the Americans were talking about a new rules-based order where the United States was the center of a global order, where the economic order benefited the United States, where the strategic order benefited the United States, and America remained at the top of the unipolar global order. So I think the unipolar moment has passed, Srini. I think there is also a growing consensus among international relations scholars and students that the unipolar moment has passed. But it doesn't mean that we don't know what is going to emerge. China has, of course, become a great power today. Right? China is the world's second largest economy. China could become the world's largest economy. And this is a challenge the United States has not faced in its history over you look at the last 150 years. Because when we look at the Soviet Union and the United States, at the peak of its power, the Soviet Union in the 1970s, when the United States faced back-to-back geopolitical setbacks in the 1970s, the Soviet economy was roughly 56 to 57% of the US economy. I wrote about it just 2 weeks ago, before the Venezuelan invasion. The Chinese economy is already close to 70% of the size of the US economy. So America hasn't faced this kind of a challenge, right? Okay, China, from a geopolitical point of view, China may not have the kind of access network or alliance system which the Soviets had built. The Chinese approach is completely different. But still, China poses the most serious systemic challenge to the United States. So you have the unipolar moment has passed. A new great power is emerging. And Russia is trying to reassert itself in Europe using military forces by invading Ukraine. So you have multiple power centers today. So Russia, I think, is the weakest link among the three, of course. So that's why I called it, it's basically a multipolar order, but with bilateral characteristics. So what matters is the United States and China. So unipolarity is gone. So the United States, I think, is frantically trying to reassert itself. And the current generation of American leaders, especially with regard to Trump, he's not bothered about international law. He is also, he's behaving as if he is this imperial overlord, right? Issuing his decrees from Truth Social. So international law or rules, norms do not matter to him. But there is also a method to the madness. The method, I think, is that they want complete, absolute control over the Western Hemisphere. So particularly with regard to Venezuela, so China was a major investor. China was a major purchaser of Venezuelan oil. So the United States wants to basically kick out China or control the oil sales to China and basically box out the Russians from Venezuela. And Venezuela is also a key supplier of oil to Cuba, where there is a huge energy crisis. So if the Venezuelans stop, or if the United States takes over the Venezuelan oil supplies, stops or pays down supplies to Cuba, they expect the Cuban government would be in deeper peril, right? So if Venezuelan government, if they can control Venezuela's oil resources, and Cuba, the United States continues to see Cuba as a hostile power. I don't know why, because Cuba doesn't pose any, or even Venezuela. I mean, from a classical realist point of view, these countries do not pose any security threat to the United States at all, right? So I mean, the American response to these changes, these massive changes that are underway in the global order, is to frantically they are trying to reassert their control. But you also see, I mean, I was very, very much interested in the way the United States carried out the operation. You have already discussed about it. I mean, unlike in 2003, when the Americans went into Iraq and brought in regime change, here the Americans are very, very careful not to get stuck in the war. So they went there, they carried out an operation, a risky operation, abducted the president, they came back. And now they are trying to use all the existing pressure mechanisms, right? Including the naval quarantine, the threat of sending boots on the ground, etc., to reshape the behavior of the regime. So this is more or less, this is an operation aimed at the regime change behavior rather than regime change itself. So the United States is basically trying to reassert itself in the hemisphere because it sees that its position as the world's preeminent power, the center of the global order, is being shaken.
Yeah, you're right. As you rightly pointed out, it is trying to reshape regime change behavior rather than regime change, and
Yeah,
that to understand that we have to look into the domestic politics of United States. Now, the forces that propelled Donald Trump to power include those forces who are opposed to the neocons and the Republican establishment who went about this regime change business in Iraq, right? These forces opposed these actions because Americans were also affected. Thousands of Americans died in the Iraq War,
yeah,
and this fueled this so-called isolationist emphasis of Trump. But again, contradictorily, he goes ahead and does all these things in Venezuela. But at the same time, from a strategic point of view, the CIA tells him, "Don't take it further. You will be bogged down," and he
yeah,
backs off. At the same time, he also knows among the MAGA community there is a section of the MAGA community that opposes these kind of interventions abroad, and therefore he's playing to that community as well. Thirdly, another point you mentioned about Cuba, right? What is it about Cuba that the Americans are so riled about it and who have imposed almost an 80-year-old blockade,
yeah,
preventing Cuba from accessing resources and also preventing any country which wants to provide access to resources to Cuba by imposing sanctions on those countries as well, or the companies which do that. This kind of what is a criminal blockade has continued for centuries, and that's where you have to understand the role of people like Marco Rubio, who is now the Secretary of State, who are basically emigres from the Cuban community, or rather, the next generation of progeny of the emigres from the Cuban American community, who made their mark in Miami politics. This community is viscerally opposed to the communist government in Cuba, and they have always justified any measure that the Americans have taken against Cuba, including trying to kill Fidel Castro. You know
yeah,
the famous saying that he was tried to be killed 600 times or so, or imposing every economic stricture that is possible, including blockades, the very stringent Helms-Burton Act, even preventing Cubans to travel to the United States and so on. Only during Obama's regime there was a let-off. Obama, during his second tenure, if you remember correctly, he went to Cuba. He shook hands with Raul Castro, and there was at least a civilian exchange of
yeah.
differences. And we
Reopen the
thought
embassy, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. So we thought this would lead to some kind of a change, but as soon as Trump came back to power, the Cuban American lobby insisted on getting back the hostile approach, and the hostilities have only continued since then. The Cubans tried to mitigate this by making use of the anti-imperialist, impulse in other parts of Latin America. So the pink tide that happened in Latin America gave an opening to the Cubans, and Cuba, with specifically to Venezuela, also provided medicine, and there was an oil for doctors program where Cuba got oil, and Cuba supplied doctors who will help in the barrios in Venezuela and helping the poor people out. So this was a very unique approach that the Cubans tried to do using the goodwill of leaders like Hugo Chavez or Bolivia's Evo Morales and so on. This is again something that the United States have tried to thwart, and now they have managed to successfully do so. And partially, I think this operation was not just targeted at Venezuela, but deliberately targeted at Cuba as well. Some of the at least one of the ships was bound to Cuba. The first ship that was interdicted was bound to Cuba, and which could have taken some supplies to Havana, and rest of it was going to China. That was the first ship to be interdicted. Marco Rubio has been on record saying that he wants the regime to go in Cuba, and that's why they don't mind if Cubans are suffering for that. So clearly, this domestic emphasis from hardliners within the Cuban American community and the Republican section, they are also motivating factors for these actions. Apart from the geopolitical moment that you rightly and so elucidated so well. So these two factors are taking this operation forward. Now the question remains: will Cuba survive? In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba went through a similar crisis, and probably even a more elongated period of hardship for close to a decade, and the regime survived and thrived. Right.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it is not as if the Cubans have not gone through this period before, and they realize that this kind of criminal blockade and this kind of coercive actions against the people are being done from a very narrow and imperialist mindset. And the resident, the Cuban people will not welcome these things, even if there are some of them don't like the regime. These are all humans with dignity, and so I think that such methods might not succeed. At the same time, there is, how much can a people endure, right? There is a limit to endurance. So that is the question that we all of us have to talk about. This imperialism is not just a set of it's not just a Game of Thrones kind of thing. People doing certain moves. It affects rulers going ahead. Yeah, it affects people drastically, and like what happened in West Asia. That's why I wanted to ask you this question, Stan. Every time the United States does things like this, right, trying to intervene in other parts of the world, it sets off, a series of unintended consequences that dramatically affect the people of those parts, right? We saw what happened in Iraq, we saw what happened in Libya, and so on. So I think if you can weigh on, and explain to our viewers, right, this is not just some geopolitical intrigue on president is being ferreted away and put into trial and so on. It's basically imperialism affects people dramatically. And if you can lend your West Asian expertise and tell us, the presidents from West Asia and how that could play out in Latin America as well.
So we also have a few questions, but I will answer your question first, Srini, and then we will read out some questions from our subscribers. So West Asia, the best example is Iraq. You already talked about Iraq. So, the Americans went into Iraq in 2003. So when the Americans went into Iraq, they thought that they will bring in regime change because Saddam Hussein's government it was a hollowed out regime, right? They were under sanctions for more than 10 years. There was no economy at all. And the Shias were revolting, the Kurds were revolting, and Saddam's regime was concentrated basically in the center and the south. But the Americans thought that this would be a walk in the park. They thought that the Iraqis would line up with with bouquets to welcome them, the liberators, the American liberators, the Yankee liberators. But we know what happened in Iraq, and also the consequences of that invasion in Iraq. The invasion itself turned out to be completely disastrous. When Saddam's regime fell, it was like a breach of the dam, right? So when the regime fell, the country fell into a deep cycle of civil war. And how many people were killed? I mean, up to 1 million people were killed because of the war and the ongoing and the subsequent violence. And 1 million people, and that's huge. That's 10 lakh people, and many more were affected by the war. And the extreme violence continued to rile Iraq for decades. So that is one thing. And not just that, we all when we started writing in the Hindu 10 years ago, 12 years ago, the Islamic State was a major sensation, right? The Islamic State, the terrorist entity, it just rose from nowhere and then started killing people, capturing territories. So what is the history of the Islamic State? The Islamic State was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq was not there when Saddam Hussein was in power. Because when the Americans went into Iraq, they said that they were going to Iraq to fight Al-Qaeda. But Saddam Hussein also didn't. Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator. I have no love and sympathy for Saddam. Saddam Hussein was the leader who gassed his own people. But Saddam Hussein was not an Islamist. Saddam Hussein was the guy who fought the Islamists. Right. And then you went to Iraq and brought down Saddam Hussein. And then the collapse of the regime that radicalized an entire community. And Zarqawi built his network, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in the post-Saddam void in Iraq. And they killed Zarqawi in 2006. But the organization, the network Zarqawi built survived. And then Al-Maqdisi, Al-Misri comes, Omar Baghdadi comes, and then Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi comes. So it was Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is actually the survivor, was the successor of Zarqawi. And it was Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi who turned Al-Qaeda in Iraq into Islamic State in Iraq. And it was Islamic State in Iraq that became Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And Syria is another example. The Americans wanted regime change in Syria. Immediately after the protests broke out in Syria, everybody wanted. The Americans, the Europeans, the Turks, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Jordanians, the Emiratis. And everybody was, backing their own militias in Syria against the government of Bashar al-Assad. Again, I have no love for Bashar. Bashar, wasn't he a dictator? He was. But he was not the only dictator in the town, right? You look at this region, or you look at faraway regions. You have different political systems in the world. But then everybody wanted to bring down Bashar al-Assad's regime. And the moment civil war, gripped Syria, and then Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi found an opportunity to expand his organization. So then he would send his men across the border to Syria to open a new branch of Al-Qaeda, and then Jabhat al-Nusra was established. An interesting fact is that the guy Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi sent to Syria is currently the president of Syria. He changed his name. He changed the name of his organization, but the guy remains the same. You look, and Libya is another example. Today we are talking about violence across Sahel. The American Trump himself bombed Nigeria just a couple of weeks ago, right? Because of the Islamic State in West Africa, ISWAP, because of Islamic State province in West Africa, and the Islamic State gained a foothold in Africa after the collapse of the Libyan government.
Libya.
Because the collapse of the Libyan government,
Mali, Somalia.
Yes, exactly. So jihadists or these extremist militant groups, they expanded from North Africa across the Sahel to West Africa, establishing different branches of extremist organizations. And now the same United States, which bombed Libya, which brought down the Libyan government, destroyed the Libyan state. I mean, this was one of the most stable governments in Africa.
Yes.
Gaddafi was there in power for 40 years. Right?
Yes.
And then the same Americans are now going to West Africa to fight the Islamic State. So the point I'm trying to make is that, yes, I mean, this is not only about, this is not a boardroom game. This is not a chess game or an essay competition. The actual decisions you make, you bring in regimes, you topple regimes, you send troops, you pull them back. This will have both intended and unintended consequences, and those consequences will last for years or even decades.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you this question because I want to tell our readers that we need a third world, or we should not call it third world anymore, a developing world perspective on these interventions, right? Yeah. The Western press will keep on telling you, this is for that interest, and Maduro is a bad guy, replace a bad guy with a good guy. They would make it seem like it's just like a chess game in which moves are being made by the so-called leaders of the free world. But they don't realize that these actions have so much uninterconnected, as Stanley now, elucidated in so much detail. And the presidents of what happened in West Asia is there for all to see. Latin America might not go in the direction. Institutions are far more stable in Latin America, and extremism of the kind we saw in West Asia might not occur there. But there is no telling what this could lead to in terms of civil conflict if these kind of actions persist. If this action happens in Colombia, who knows? Colombia was a dictatorship not very long ago, and it also had a civil war of its own not long ago, which lasted for decades and finally got ended. Probably a decade back. Who knows what turn Colombia would take? Who knows what turn if this intervention in Venezuela goes to the extent of seeking dramatic regime change? Who knows what kind of civil conflict this will descend into? So I think we need to look at this from the developing world perspective and understand what the consequences are of this so-called Yankee actions or American actions, and these are damaging not just for Latin America. These are damaging for the rest of the world because it's interconnected world and so on. I think Stanley, you're back. Stanley, we'll take some questions now.
Yeah, we'll take some questions. Yes. So just one thing, since you talked about Colombia, and the Trump administration is actively backing Bolsonaro in Brazil, who is a self-declared fan of the military dictatorship.
Yes.
So Arun Kumar Swaminathan is asking if Delcy Rodriguez is a proxy of Trump. Also, what will China do in this crisis? So this question, I have seen this debate online platforms. For example, Tariq Ali, some left-wing intellectuals had also raised the same question. You talked about the pragmatic side, but how do you address this question?
I don't think we should immediately come to such conclusions then. Let's put ourselves in those shoes, right? It's a hypothetical situation. Let's put ourselves in those shoes. Our elected president is taken away from the country, and let's say we are in positions of power. Then what do we do, right? And it is an asymmetric relationship. The United States clearly has some military power which is far superior than that of Venezuela. you can't go and order an invasion of the United States. That's out of the realm of possibility. So what do
Yeah.
you do in this situation? You need regime stability and no deterioration of the economy. This is what any leader would do if that leader was pragmatic and also concerned about the stability of the country. So to jump into a conclusion that Delcy Rodriguez is a proxy for Trump just because she asked for conciliation is I think is a jump into speculation which I am not willing to consider as of now. One. Secondly, there are other conspiracy theories as to how was it that Maduro was easily extracted and his Cuban the Cuban entourage of security personnel who were placed with him were killed and so on, and it could have not happened unless there were some kind of an internal break where people in the regime actually preferred this to happen. These are all again speculative questions we don't know the answer to, but we know that let's look at how Israel demolished the Hezbollah using
Yep.
smartphones, right?
Yeah.
Or how
Yeah.
how I mean, how there is an asymmetric technological power that these countries like the United States have that are far superior than any other countries. So sometimes we need to apply Pareto's principle and look for the more easier answer. The more easier answer is simply that the CIA's network in Venezuela and the military superpower and technological power of the United States is far superior than that of the defense forces in Venezuela, and therefore such an operation was made possible. And this operation did not just pick out Maduro and go away. If I'm not wrong, around 80 people died, right? Of them, 30
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
Cubans. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Including 32
interestingly, not many people are talking about this. I'm a bit surprised. In 2020, there was this operation called Operation Gideon, launched by some private sector security forces. It was an amateurish action. They sent some troops to, which included Green Berets and so on, to enter Venezuela in a place called Macuto. And take care, we control an airfield and then go ahead and capture
Yeah.
Maduro. This was
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
operation that
Yeah.
was planned in 2020.
Yeah.
It flopped. But again, that was an action that, like Bay of Pigs in Cuba, done by private mercenaries and so on. This time it's the United States military which is directly involved, and they have a power asymmetry that can overwhelm any force. So to therefore, from looking into this and suggesting that Delcy Rodriguez's succession is a consequence of Trump doing these actions and there is some premeditation to it is, I think, not a logical way of looking at things now. We never know, but from what I can see, I don't think she's some proxy or anything like that.
Right.
And you have to understand the history. Delcy Rodriguez's father was a militant left-wing activist who was tortured by the Venezuelan intelligence in the 1960s. He was a part of a left-wing guerrilla movement, and Delcy Rodriguez and her brother have been left-wing activists for a very long time. And these are not some random actors. They are also enforcers of the Maduro regime. Delcy Rodriguez presides over a very harsh authoritarian apparatus that targets Venezuelan opposition. And they have stakes in making the regime continue. So we cannot just simply read this as some proxy of Trump actually helping Trump here. So it's not as simple as that. But this question, I think you should take this question: what will China do in this crisis, or what will it not do?
Yeah. So there is also a subsequent question. I'll answer both. Aditi is asking, will this invasion embolden China and Russia with regard to Taiwan and Ukraine? So if I take both questions, but first on Ukraine. So Ukraine, we have always argued, Srini, I've written in text and context and in op-eds also that there is a very slim chance for a peace deal in Ukraine. There was no chance for a ceasefire. There is a very slim chance for a peace deal because the ceasefire, I think everybody has now set it aside because everybody knows that the Russians are not going to stop fighting. But the Russians insist that they want a ceasefire. But I think there is a very slim chance for a peace deal. There is a very slim chance for a peace deal as well, because there are irreconcilable positions on both sides. It's very difficult to bring both of them together, both Ukraine and Russia. So this, this is likely to be settled on the battlefield. It will be ugly either side. So that is one thing. And will this embolden the Russians? Definitely it will. So when the Russians will look at this, what happened in Venezuela, the Russians had a footprint in Venezuela, but they are unable to do anything about it. They were unable to do anything in Syria as well because they are so stuck in Ukraine, right? So in Syria also, that was a massive setback for the Russians. I remember a lot of pro-Russian handles were saying that no, Syria, it's okay. The Russians will continue to have their military bases, but it's not like that. I mean, how the Americans will look at it is that Russia's closest ally, the government, just collapsed when Turkish-backed, NATO-backed jihadists and militias went into Damascus, and President Putin couldn't do anything. So that is weakness, right? And that perception matters in international relations, right? And based on that, the Americans will make their next move. So same in the case of Venezuela. Both the Russians and the Chinese were not able to do anything. So Venezuela is far away. I mean, and also the Chinese, we know that they won't get militarily involved. That's their policy, at least as of now. They won't get militarily involved. They don't want to fight wars. The last war they fought was in 1970s against Vietnam. So, I mean, this is also, their focus is they're laser focused on their own economic development, on building their own position. Yes. So the Chinese are definitely not going to get involved militarily, but the Chinese were economically, they were pretty much involved in Venezuela. They were buying Venezuelan oil. And the economic relationship between these two had offered a lifeline to basically the Venezuelan government. And now the Chinese would, I think, take a very wait and watch approach. They would see how the United States is going to shape Venezuela's oil sector in the coming days, whether the United States would succeed in doing so, because we still don't know. It is still in a very, very early stage. So the Chinese would take, I think, a wait and watch approach with regard to Venezuela. But with regard to their policy towards East Asia, I think this would basically what we call, this is some kind of, let's say, return of the spheres of influence. So the Americans want to reassert their influence or establish their hegemony in Western Hemisphere. The Chinese would like to do, okay, they may not have the free hand like the Americans have in the Caribbean waters, but the Chinese would definitely try to at least reinforce their presence in their backyard. So that may not be good news for Taiwan. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not making any predictions, but definitely the Chinese will see that if this is the early stage of a new Cold War, new competition between the United States and China, and if the United States is establishing their hegemony in Western Hemisphere aimed at kicking China out of the region, the Chinese might make faster moves in consolidating their position in their backyard. And the Russians are unlikely to make any concessions because, after seeing what happened in Venezuela, after looking at the statements, the agreement recently reached between the French and the Brits, where they said that if there is a peace deal, they were willing to send troops to Ukraine. So then the Russians might ask themselves, then why should we have a peace deal? If I am going to agree to a peace deal, I am going to get the French and British troops in my backyard. So I would rather continue to fight, right? So I think what is happening in the world right now will basically reinforce the ideas of spheres of influence, where these great powers would try to consolidate their position in their backyard, while preparing themselves for a long-lasting competition with the United States.
And it is a very fragile moment. Taiwan, for example, is the world's foundry for chips, right? Most of the chips that are manufactured in the world are the best foundries are in Taiwan. And if a conflict happens in Taiwan, this could disrupt the global economy dramatically. So this is a very fragile moment, and the actions taken by the United States are actually pushing the world to a tipping point, which it takes enlightened minds and strategic thinkers to not push it further. And we can say that we are hopeful that it won't happen, but things are not looking very promising, because if you have this kind of situation where regional hegemons, can get away with what they want to do in their respective regional areas, that means there is a collapse of international law. And this idea that globalization and movement of goods and even people to some extent across the world would prevent these regimes from taking drastic decisions, that lifeline or that buffer is weakened. So this is a very dangerous moment for a dangerous moment for the world.
So we will take two more questions, Rini. We have a
Yeah,
lot of questions
sure,
actually, but we
sure.
have, yeah. So there are a couple of questions about India.
India, yeah.
Asking us how do we look at India's position, where does it leave India, what are India's options, etc., etc. So what do you think at India's position? What
I'll
about India's
talk
position?
about you can talk about strategy, Stan. I'll talk about the economic thing.
Yeah,
You know, India is one of the few countries in the world which has the ability to process the high, strong crude that exists in the Orinoco Basin in Venezuela, right? In fact, very interestingly, in the last year or so, I think in 2024, if I'm not wrong, or even 2023, 2023, yes, in 2023, what had happened during the Biden government, the Biden government had actually diluted some of the very harsh sanctions against Venezuela, and during that period, Reliance actually was able to take some of the crude from the basin and to process it in India, right? So if there is a situation of in a normal situation, right, when the Americans are not involved in this way, then this offers an economic opportunity for many countries, including in India, because India has the capacity to process their crude. India also is a net importer of oil, and therefore, considering our energy needs, a stable Venezuela is in our interest also, and
yeah,
Venezuelans will actually welcome Indian investment and Indian trade Indian trade in terms of oil supplies to India, and so in a perfect world that would have been great. In fact, Reliance yesterday came up with a statement saying that if it is allowed to do so, if it is permitted to do so, it would like to buy Venezuelan oil. So
yeah,
it depends on how the Americans take this transition. If they believe that if they can control Venezuelan oil at the same time allow for a global um, global trade in this parts, which could benefit them as well, because if you diversify the oil extraction activities, it benefits everyone. So if the Americans allow it, then probably India could also benefit from that. So it depends on how the Americans act in this situation. That's all. Secondly, we have to look at it from a global south perspective. India traditionally has always taken the line that no country can treat another country as its own backyard. It cannot invade another country. That has been our position forever, even during Narendra Modi's government. And I think that will that position will endure, even if realistically speaking, India has no say in what is going to happen in Venezuela. Which is why we saw this weird statement that we said we hope this Venezuelan people are not affected. There was nothing else talked about in terms of
yeah,
what
yeah.
the Trump regime did. But if you can weigh on that.
Yeah, so I was also thinking about it. I understand that India's reluctance to condemn the
Yeah.
American attack. Usually, India doesn't condemn actions by other countries. One of the recent instances was the Israeli attack on Qatar that India
Gaza.
condemned without naming the Israelis. But
Yeah.
otherwise, India doesn't condemn. So Russian invasion also we haven't condemned. But India had, in the case of Russia, India had articulated a position. India said that it supports sovereignty and territorial integrity of every nation. And Indian
Mm.
Prime Minister told the Russian president that this is not the time of the war. At least we have taken a position while retaining your economic and strategic partnership with the Russians. So here also, I'm not asking the Indian government to cut off ties with the United States over its intervention in Venezuela. No, that's not going to happen. But you need to articulate a position, right? You can't. I mean, if you are a responsible power, you are a global South member. So you need to take a position, and I think that position is that you should express your concern about the American intervention, both to the United States as well as the world. That was missing. I think that is very important. I'm not asking India to condemn the United States. I'm not asking India to, disrupt your partnership with the United States. United States is an important partner, but I'm asking you to articulate a position. I am asking you that you need to tell the world that what the Americans, because this is not in India's interest. If the United
Absolutely.
States can go to the global south and topple governments, abduct the presidents, no, it's not going to serve your interest, right? You have already talked about the economic point of view, but from a strategic point of view, I think India should have taken a clear position, letting the world know its displeasure, its concerns, so that we haven't done.
And that
So
is a
that is,
problem with this, yeah, and that's a problem with this transactionist foreign policy that is being conducted by the current regime,
yeah, yeah,
the BJP government.
yeah,
They seem to look at things from a transactional point of view and avoid any principled, articulation of foreign policy.
yeah.
So that is why you see what India has done with respect to the actions in Gaza,
Gaza.
or even in the Qatar thing, without naming Israel, they have questioned this thing, because they also are dependent on Qatar for economic ties. So therefore, again, there's a transaction involved there. So that is the reason why this why we see this some kind of a schizophrenia, if you can call it that way, in the way we are articulating our government's opinion on these matters.
Yeah. So, one last question, Srini. So, what is the political future of Venezuela in the light of this invasion? If I add my corollary, what is the political and economic future of Venezuela after the US invasion of the country?
So, as things stand, even before the invasion, Venezuela's economy was under deep distress. Ever since the oil price fall in 2014, since then, for the last 10 years, it has been in crisis. There has been some improvement in the economy in the last couple of years because of some of the measures taken by the Maduro government, especially instituted by the current president Delcy Rodriguez, and which helped mitigate some of the worst problems in the economy. But those problems still persist. So in terms of livelihood problems, food remains food remains costly. Essential goods are very costly. There is a dual currency that is there in the Venezuelan economy. So there is one section of the economy who can afford to use dollars. They are benefiting out of it. Another section of the economy which is not, which is suffering because of it. And those who are suffering because of it, one section has actually fled the country, which has resulted in this huge migration problem from Venezuela, which Trump has attacked. Also, if you notice, the UN had said that 7 million people had fled Venezuela in the last few years. So the economic crisis persists. Now, the only way out there are two ways out of this problem. One is a short, one is to get out of this problem in the immediate, and to come up with a long-term long-term solution so that these problems. The short-term issue is that the inefficiencies and the inability of PDVSA to basically produce and extract more oil and sell it in the market and get get that to finance the government. That is now hampered, and the government is now trying very hard to solve that problem. And if the United States actually allows this as part of a quid pro quo, they might be able to sort this problem out. The long-term problem is basically Venezuela's economy is a one-track economy. It's an economy dependent only on oil extraction and sale of oil. It's not a diversified economy, and this is a resource curse. Any country which depends only on one commodity can be expected to go through these problems if it is already an unequal state. So the Hugo Chavez regime before Mr. Maduro took over was cognizant of it and wanted to diversify the economy, but they couldn't manage to do it. But if Venezuela emerges out of this crisis, relatively unscathed, I think that should be the focus of the Venezuelan government, to build a Venezuelan industry that is not driven entirely only by oil. As things stand, though, it will all depend on what the Americans will do or will not do. And the current stance of the Americans is not reasonable, and so I expect more turmoil to happen and Venezuela to go through further turmoil. It will depend upon how the Venezuelan people react to it. If they believe that these actions by an imperialist power requires some degree of solidarity and coming together of various forces to protect the Venezuelan economy, and then probably they can weather this crisis. But it's a difficult proposition. It's going to not be easy at all.
Thanks, Srini. So thanks to our audience for joining us, for all our subscribers. We will continue these webinars. Also, read our explainers, analysis, comments, and editorials. We take a position where we have to take a position. So I hope you continue to enjoy the journalism we do. So thank you very much. We will continue this discussion, Srini.
Yeah, thanks, Stan. To our readers, again, just as Stanley pointed out, please do follow our analysis. We try to come with, an original insight and not to be led by what the West is talking about these matters, while at the same time hold true to our constitutional principles of democracy, equality, and so on. And so I request you to please subscribe to the Hindu and read our explainers, analysis, opinions, and our news coverage. Thank you very much.
And videos.
Yes, and videos as well.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.